Welcome to our podcast. We're excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I will be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast. Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. We're so glad to have you listening in again this week. This week I have joining me as Taylor Carnes, who is our client liaison. I'm excited to have Taylor join me as we discuss the topic of unsafe people. Last time on our podcast, we completed our 4-part series on boundaries. If you did not get a chance to listen, please go back and catch the boundaries series. We will list the link in our show notes. I'm glad that you all are joining us as we will be discussing what is a safe person. This can be a really hard definition to define, especially if you have been in unhealthy relationships, which most of us have had at least one, or we might know others who have been in unhealthy relationships. So you might want to grab something to take a few notes as we dig into today's topic. Welcome, Taylor. I'm so glad to have you joining me again in the podcast studio today.
Thanks, Anne. I'm really glad to be back in the studio today.
That's good. This is going to be a fun topic, I think. I think when we think of the word unsafe or safe people, we might not think fun topic. But I think at least another way to think of that, it's going to be a very interesting and I think valuable topic for our listeners today.
Yeah, I agree. I think as I've been studying this topic, it's kind of reminded me of who is a safe person in my life and who has been an unsafe person in my life, and I think it'll do that for our listeners today too. Yeah,
and that might be something good for our listeners to do as we're kind of going through this. Just as you think of these different categories, maybe identify or think through people in their own life, because sometimes I don't know about others, but for me, it's easier for me to process through something when I can make it practical. I can make it relatable to my own life. And so that might be helpful as we're kind of starting today. You might even pause the podcast real quick and say, I'm going to make a list of a couple of people. It doesn't have to be long, maybe 2 or 3, and just say, I identify this person. I think that they are a safe person. I think of this person as unsafe. And then as you're learning about what it means to be safe and unsafe, that list might shift.
Yeah, that's something that I noticed when I was going through that is when I was identifying who's safe and unsafe, I realized some things that I thought were safe were not, or people I thought were safe were not safe. That doesn't mean they can't become safe people, right. But in my life, they weren't safe people to me.
Yeah, because sometimes we get confused of what the word safety means. And so it can be a little difficult to know how to define it if we don't know what that word actually means. We might go, well, I know what the word safe means. If we think of the word safe just in a general context, what are some words that kind of come up as you're thinking about the word safe?
Well, for me, when I first think of the word safe, I tend to think of places that are safe.
Okay, yeah.
And so I start thinking of like hospitals and the police station and things like that where that's a safe place to be. That's what comes up for me.
Yeah, so when you talk about those places, I also think of security. You know, I would feel secure there. So a lot of times we might equate those two words, safety and security, together. So before we get too far into the weeds, let's kind of jump into our topic for today, which is what is a safe person, right? So defining a safe person. So when we think of someone who is safe, what are some things that we might think about, or what might be some thoughts that come up when we think of that? Someone who is safe. Sorry, I said that incorrectly. So hopefully our listeners caught that.
So some things that might come up is someone who accepts us, someone who loves us no matter what, someone who we can be ourselves around, someone who helps us grow. Those are all things that I think of.
Yeah, so accepting. Let's talk a little bit about accepting. When we think about acceptance, sometimes, again, just like safety can be confusing, the word acceptance can be confusing too. So sometimes we think of safety as, acceptance as no matter what you do or what you say, I agree with you.
And acceptance is not agreement.
Yeah.
I think a silly example of acceptance is not agreement is I think everybody has heard this, but typically with married couples, one person with the gas gauge will let it get all the way down to E, and the other person will, when it's half a tank or 3/4, I don't know if I'm saying that right.
You're
but they have to fill the car up. And so they accept the person as they are, but they disagree that those one's good for the car, one's bad for the car. They disagree on that.
Yeah, I'm an empty tank person.
I am not.
Yeah. Nor is my husband. So we, in our early years, could cause friction, but we've learned to accept that's just who he is. That's who I am. It's not that I don't value gas in my gas tank. It's just it's a low priority on my things to do. And so I do it when it's very necessary. And so it's that idea of accepting. I think that was a really good example of we can accept the other person, but we don't have to agree with their mode. Because if you had my husband in here today, he'd be like, no, that is unacceptable. 1/4 of a tank is the lowest it should ever go. And he's very good at making sure the tanks stay at that level, and he takes care of that. And he's just so good at that. But I'm not. And so that's where that acceptance comes in of this is where he is and this is where I'm at, and I accept you for who you are. We just may not agree about the mode of how to get there. That's really good. And so that helps us kind of think about that safety. When we can be in relationship with somebody who can accept us, even though they don't agree with everything that we do, that causes that safe relationship. If you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, man, this, and you've listened to the other ones that we've done the last series with the boundaries, you might be thinking there's a strong correlation between safety and boundaries.
Yes, that came up a lot for me as I was studying safe people and having healthy boundaries. It goes hand in hand.
It does. So the more that we are in that healthy relationship we're going to have with a safe person, those boundaries are going to be more natural, I think, or they're going to seem more natural. Doesn't mean you don't have to work at it, but they're going to seem more natural in that relationship. So the next thing you mentioned was when we think of a safe person, we think of someone who loves us no matter what. And I think when we think about love in a relationship, and a lot of times we think about relationships, we think of that marital relationship, but this could also be a friend relationship, a parent-child relationship, adult parent-child relationship. So there could be so many different dynamics to this. So even if we do give it examples of marriage, think about all those other types of relationships you might have too. And so when we think of love in a relationship, I think I can correlate that really quickly to the word acceptance. Sometimes it's that they're just going to accept me or agree with me, and if they don't, then they don't love me. And so we can get all of that really kind of tangled up and confused. And so when we think about loving no matter what, can you give some good examples of what that might be like or what that might entail?
So I think a really good example is a healthy parent-child relationship. That most people, if you have a healthy relationship with your parents, you know that there's nothing you can do that is going to make your parents love you any less. And so sometimes that gets twisted in our relationships where we think if someone is angry or upset with us, if we haven't had healthy relationships in the past, that they don't love us anymore. And I think the way that people show that they still love us, even if they're angry or upset with us, is kind of the way they handle being angry and upset. It's, I'm very upset. What you did was wrong and not okay, but I still love you. I care about you. And it's just having that open communication with whoever is the person in that relationship.
Absolutely. So it's that, I love that picture of it doesn't matter, even if I'm angry with you, I'm still going to be in relationship with you. Anger or disappointment or disillusionment, any of those things doesn't mean I'm going to abandon that relationship. I'm going to do something else. So it means I'm going to stay present with you regardless of what happens. Doesn't mean I agree. Going back to the, acceptance doesn't mean I agree with your behavior. It just means that I'm going to stay present with you because I value you. And so therefore, here I am. Yeah. And so that can, those are some really important distinctions. Having that acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean agreement. I'll just review that because I think it's good for us to hear things more than once. And then just because we're angry or upset or whatever, it doesn't mean we're going to leave. We're not going to abandon the person or the person's not going to abandon us. They're going to stay present. And by staying present, it also doesn't mean that you're going to maybe always stay physically present with them. It just means you're staying present in the relationship. Because sometimes we do need physical separation from somebody when we're angry. Yeah, because we need that space just to process or heal.
Yeah, I mean, I know I don't want to use marriage examples all the time, but that's the one that came to my mind is when you have an argument with your spouse and you need space for a minute, like to go for a walk or just to go in the other room. That doesn't mean you leave for hours on end. Right. That I think would be unhealthy. Yeah. But you always come back and once you're calmer and can have a more productive conversation.
Right. Not a he said, she said, or look at what you did to me. It's more of having that conversation. How can we work through this? But we can't do that if we're in that place of anger. So that's sometimes what we need to take that break, like you said. So it's really good. And the next one you talked about with when we think of, say, people as someone we can be ourselves around. We can be our genuine self. So I kind of think of relationships, and this might even come up maybe from not just the relationships we talked about, but it could be like those professional relationships too. Because sometimes it dictates that we have to have different levels of decorum. And so that's appropriate. But thinking about those relationships of people that we're with, if you can't be yourself of who you really are, if you have to always be guarded, if you have to always be thinking about how you're behaving, or another thing that you might think of is if you always feel like you're walking on eggshells, you might not be able to be yourself.
When we're talking about someone we can be ourselves around, the word that comes to mind for me is free. Like you're free to be yourself. That person loves you no matter what. So it goes back to the acceptance and loving you no matter what. But I think that's really important in relationships to have people you can be yourself around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's so important. Well, and I love that you use the word free, because a lot of times if we can't be ourselves and actually kind of let all those walls down, it can feel a little stifling and overwhelming to you as an individual, because you're constantly trying to manage your own self so you can be who you think you have to be for somebody else. And that can add a lot of internal stress.
Yeah, like you said, you would be walking on eggshells around everyone.
Mm-hmm. But as we're kind of working through that idea of being able to be ourselves around other people, it is so valuable, because that can also stem from our past relationships or what we've had in past experiences. So maybe we didn't have a good example of having a safe relationship growing up, or maybe in our past relationships they haven't been safe. And so thinking about being myself around somebody else might feel scary.
Yeah, because you think, what are they going to think if they know whatever it is that you have a hard time showing people? Yeah. I don't know, like just different quirks you might have. But you think, what are they going to think of me? What are they going to say about me? Or you might think they're going to talk about you behind your back because of whatever that is.
Or maybe because that did happen in the past. Maybe whenever you showed that part of yourself, you were mocked or you were ridiculed, or maybe something worse happened because you were just being yourself. Not that you were doing something wrong or inappropriate, but you're just being yourself. I can think of examples in my own mind as we're talking of like when I was a younger person, and there were some things I did that were quirky, but I remember getting ridiculed for it. And I remember those behaviors I would hold in so hard because at the time I might have laughed on the outside because everybody else was laughing and I didn't want to feel kind of out there, and in the spotlight because I already felt like I was in the spotlight because everybody was making fun of me. But when I was alone, I thought, man, I got to figure out how not to do that. I got to figure out how to edit myself so that doesn't happen again. And those thoughts and those behaviors carry on into our adulthood when we don't learn, one, that we're doing that, and then two, how to change that. So that can be something for us to all to kind of think about. Am I being my true self? Am I being who I really am around the people that I'm in relationship with? That's going to help us identify if they're safe or not safe. Or I think the other part of that is there something within myself I need to work on. And then the next one that you mentioned is someone that helps us grow. What are some ways that people might help us grow? What are some things you're talking about?
So one way that people can definitely help us grow that I don't think a lot of people think of usually is asking people to help us understand things, because asking for help is so hard. Mm-hmm. And especially to admit, I don't understand what this is. And it just helps. It's learning. And so it's helping you learn, and learning is growing. So, and then I think another one is they push you towards your goals, not in an aggressive way,
right?
But they push you towards your goals, and
or encourage.
Yeah, encourage you, and they just, because I think of people in my own life who I've mentioned different goals I have too, and they've brought up things like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about, like, they've shared with me just different ideas and ways to get to that goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really helpful when we're trying to process through, like you said, we don't want people to come at us and be like yelling at us and telling us we should or shouldn't be doing something. But as someone can come alongside us, encourage us, or maybe challenge us a little bit, have you thought, like you said, have you thought of, or have you considered, or have you looked at this? And so that can really push us towards that next step. Those are really important as we're kind of thinking through, is this person safe? And I'm going to keep bringing it back to that because I want people to really be thinking about the practical application of the people in their lives of, when I'm thinking of these different traits, does this define the people around me? Yeah.
I really like that you used the word challenge when defining someone that's safe, because I think that is seen as such a negative, and it's not. You need people in your life who are going to challenge you, because that is going to help you grow and move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Challenges can be positive. I say a lot of times in counseling dynamics is that most words have a positive and a negative correlation to it. It's all how it's being used. I think another example of the word challenge, to go along with what you said with challenges, a lot of times when we hear the word consequence, we think negative. We always think punishment, but there's positive consequences in the world too. And so when we think of words, we want to think about them from both perspectives, not just one. So yeah, thank you. So that kind of brings us to our next point is, what does having safe people in our lives do for us? Or another way to think about that is, what kind of impact might they have on us or for us? And so, so hopefully, as you're thinking through your list, and you pause the video at the beginning, or the podcast at the beginning, and you have that list of people, I want you to kind of look through them and think about, do these people help me to have this type of impact, or draw me towards, or challenge me, like we just said, to have these conclusions or impacts in my life. So what are some of the things that a safe person might do for us, Taylor?
So the first one is, a safe person should bring us closer to God. And there's a number of ways that someone can do that. But I think the easiest example of someone bringing us closer to God is them praying for us or with us at different times, or just encouraging us to pray. I think I can think of examples in my own life where people who were safe challenged me to start praying for others, to start thinking of ways to be more thankful. And that brings you closer to God. And that's something a safe person does.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we would want people who around us draw us to something, which in this case, we're talking about God, that is healthy or beneficial for us, right? And so if that person's safe, they're going to push us towards or challenge us or encourage us, pray for us, whatever that may look like, to be in that right relationship with the Lord. And that is a good sign of a safe person. So the next one that we want to talk about has to do with relationships in a different way. So what might we might think about when we're thinking of some other things that people might do to have positive impact from a safe person dynamic?
A safe person brings us closer to others. They help us create healthy relationships around us. I think a lot of times when you think of unsafe people, or at least for me, I think of isolation and how those people who are unsafe tend to isolate others. A person who is safe will actually help you build relationships, and they'll bring you into friendships they have already and just help you build those healthy relationships.
That is such a good distinction, because it's something we work with a lot at Peace Restored, is that power and control dynamic, right? And so if you are in an unsafe relationship or you're around unsafe people, they're often going to insert power over you. How can I create a dynamic is kind of the question they might be asking, not directly, but indirectly, is how do I create an environment that you're going to do what I want you to do?
Yeah, exactly. I think we can bringing us closer to others back to being ourselves around them, because they're giving us that freedom with other relationships to be ourselves in those, and that's really important. It
is. It's important because we're made for relationship. And when we aren't around people who are safe, who encourage us to be in relationship with others, like you mentioned, it causes isolation, separation, which then can cause a litany of other struggles such as depression, anxiety. All these things start coming up. But because we're designed to be in a relationship, when we're around safe people who encourage us to be around other safe people, it builds a community for us, and it helps us to be stronger individuals. So there's such value and power in that.
There really is. And I think just the last few years in the world have taught us that, how important having relationships with other people is. And that's actually, there's an example in the Safe People book of a person who is, they're experiencing depression and they continue to isolate themselves, and it's making that worse. And then they get into relationships with others, and it doesn't fix their depression, but it does help.
Yeah, because that's pretty normative when we're thinking of someone who is in a deeper depressive state or even a high anxiety state, to where they continue to pull away and isolate, and it feeds into that depression. And that's why a lot of times when we encourage our clients or encourage those we work with when they say, man, they talk about being isolated, and we're like, what can you do to be around other people? How can we get you engaged? There's usually a resistance to that. But the more they can engage in that, the more you can go out and be around healthy people and those safe relationships, the more it can help draw you out of that depression. We're not saying it's the end-all be-all cure to depression. What we're saying is that is a key component. And thank you for mentioning the book Safe People. I forgot to mention that at the beginning, because this is where we're getting a lot of this material from, is from another Dr. Clouden Townsend book, Safe People. And so we'll make sure to link that in our show notes for people who want to be able to get a copy of this book for on their own, to do some more a deeper dive into the material. We'll also have at the end of the podcast, or at the end of this in our show notes, you'll be able to find some other links and resources as well that link back to the material of the Safe People book. But so just keep that in mind as you're kind of digging into that. So going back to some things some other impacts of what might happen in that safe relationship. We think about a safe person is going to bring me closer to the person that I'm supposed to be. Yeah. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
I think that one can honestly just go back to pushing us towards our goals, because typically our goals are the goals we set for ourselves are pushing us towards who we were created to be. And when we have our relationships with other people, when we just describe someone pushing us towards our goals, that's them helping us become who we were meant to be.
That's good. Yeah, so we want someone who's going to be in relationship with us that's going to draw us towards who we're supposed to be. If you're in a relationship with somebody who keeps telling you that you're not worthy, that you aren't, that you don't have value, that you shouldn't try anything, that your only value is to stay put and be quiet, those are some things that you really need to wrestle with. Because that is the opposite of what we're talking about here. And if that is you and you are listening to this podcast, you're like, man, I am hearing so many things that are the opposite of the people I'm in relationship with, reach out. Even if it's not to us at Peace Restored, find a counselor, someone you can trust, a safe person, right? Because your counselor should be a safe person. If your counselor isn't a safe person, then man, jump ship and find somebody else. But find that safe person that you can relate to, that can hear you, that can be an encourager to you, that can help you to be the person you've been meant to be. And that's it's part of our, what we say here at Peace Restored is that's part of our purpose, is to help women find who their God-designed purpose is. Because we believe each individual woman has a God-designed purpose. And we want to help them towards that. So if that's your story and you're sitting in that space and you say, I don't have anybody around me that's drawing me to that, reach out, contact us. You can go to our website, peacerestored.net, and learn more about us there. But then that takes us to, as we're kind of pivoting through this topic of safe people or what are safe people, there's some categories that we want to put safe people in. Can you quickly kind of list those 3 categories, then we'll go into talking about them a little bit more in depth?
So the first one is connection.
Okay.
And then the next one would be grace, and the third one would be truth.
Okay. Excuse me. So when we think of connection, we've talked a little bit about that. Another word that some people might think of is kind of that dwelling or being present with is another word I think of when the ability to be present with somebody. So when you think of connection, what's some things that come along with that? Because some people might think of because connection, again, I think is one of those words that can have that both negative and positive context to it. So somebody could say, man, this person's connected to me because they never leave me. They're always with me no matter where I go. They're always know what I'm doing. They're always checking to see how much I spend because they care for me. That might feel to some as something that's caring because they're connected.
So connection means more being emotionally and fully present with someone. So the easiest example I think of this is when you're talking to someone and they're on their phone and they are saying they're listening to you, but they're not. They could be listening,
right?
Because most of us can multitask, but they're not fully present with you.
Yeah,
and that's that connection piece. That's where it's different from what you were talking about with checking in. I wouldn't personally see that as connection.
Right. No. But some, again, if we've come from an unhealthy dynamic, right, we might go, well, this person's trying to connect with me. They're trying to be with me. But in essence, what they're doing is they're trying to control. They're not trying to connect. And those are strong differentiations, right? From what you're saying is that connection is I'm emotionally present. I'm emotionally available. I'm going to, when you talk to me, I'm going to look you in the eyes. If you're here in the room with me, I'm going to listen in. I'm not going to be sitting here going, oh, Taylor's saying this, and so I need to know what I'm going to say next. No, I'm just listening. I'm present with you. And that's really powerful as we're building out that relationship with somebody, because when we can be in that space where you're able to connect with somebody from an emotional standpoint like that, what does that do for that dynamic, do you think?
It creates a trust and care, and you're able to have like a real healthy relationship with people. And I cannot stress enough how important healthy relationships are, and how much better life is when you have healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
And it's hard to know if you've never had a healthy relationship what that looks like. Yeah. Because a lot of times people who haven't experienced connection, they will have those unhealthy dynamics, and they will think that that's love and care, and they're more comfortable in it. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So it might, as we're talking through these things, you might be feeling some friction internally, and that's normal. But just kind of sit in that space with us, if you will, and kind of hang in to the end where, like I said, we're going to continue to give you more resources, but we really want you to think about these things deeper, and because we want you to be able to apply them, not just learn new information. And so hopefully you can hang in with us as we're talking through some of these hard things. And please, if you're hearing this, don't feel that this is a judgment on you. If you are in a place of unsafe relationships, that's not what we're here for. We're here just to help equip you as an individual to learn and to grow and to develop to be better. Because once we know differently, then that's when we can do differently. We can't do differently if we don't know. Yeah. And that's what this podcast is about, right? So the next one you talked about was grace. When we think about grace and unsafe people, how do those two words go together?
Well, grace is, if you don't know what grace is, grace would be unmerited or unearned favor with a person. So it's better than what you deserve. So for me, I think of if someone lies to me, and whether it was intentional or not, and they come back to me and they say, I'm really sorry, I lied to you about this, and if I were a safe person, I would say, I forgive you, it's all good, and just let it go. Yeah. Whereas if I'm unsafe, depending on what it is, because sometimes you may need to have a conversation, but an unsafe person would just become angry and upset. And I'm not saying if you're a safe person, you can't be angry or upset. Right. But it's different. There's no forgiveness. There's no grace. Yeah. Yeah. And so when you're in that dynamic of being able to show grace in that relationship, being able to be, I think it makes me go back to the beginning of the podcast where we talked about acceptance. It's that I don't have to agree with you, but I accept you. And so along with acceptance often comes grace, right? Because if we go back to that gas tank example, right? If the person's driving and we weren't giving them grace to be able to do differently, like for example, my husband gives me a lot of grace to let my car go to empty. And even though it frustrates him, he doesn't react in an angry fashion, right? He doesn't come yelling at me and belittling me. He's just like, okay, I'm going to give her grace. I'm going to allow her to be who she is and allow her to kind of, and I'm still going to care for her. Because that's important to him, he'll often go and fill my gas tank up for me and get it to where, he feels that it's safe. And so by giving each other that grace and that space, it allows us to be cared for well, because he can step in that space and care for me well. Because I think if we think of the opposite of that, if he was instead that unsafe person, and every time my gas tank got below the quarter of a tank, he came and yelled at me and belittled me and told me terrible things.
that just feels heavy. That would not be a good place to be at, right? It would not draw us together. And so I think that's kind of what you're talking about with that grace as since we were talking about that gas in the beginning, I thought that was a good tie-in.
I really like when you were talking about that, how you mentioned that it's letting you be who you are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's exactly how you said it,
yeah,
but
that's fine.
It goes back to the being yourself.
Yeah.
And even though it's something he disagrees with, it's being yourself. And then I think that also ties into grace, where he fills it up for you. There's,
because he doesn't have to do that, right?
Yeah, and so that shows unconditional love for you, I think.
That unmerited favor that you're talking about, because he doesn't have to do that.
Yeah.
It's that I'm just going to do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think another way that we can talk about grace is saying that the person is for us. They want us to succeed, which, they want us to succeed. And I think that can go back to boundaries too.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Because when someone was to succeed, there's a healthy boundary there, right? They're like, how can I help you get to where you are? So, because that person is for us. Mm-hmm. They're trying to help us move in the direction that we need to go. And you also mentioned how that all ties into unconditional love. It doesn't mean that we're going to love perfectly, right? I think there's a differentiation between loving perfectly and unconditional. And because we can love someone well and love them in spite of their flaws. Because when you're in a relationship of any type, whether it's a married relationship, or a parent-child relationship like we mentioned, or just even a friend relationship, 100% of the time in a relationship, that person will fail you. It doesn't mean every time they're going to fail you, but 100% of relationships is another way to put that. And the other person in that relationship will fail you. There is no way around it. It may be little things and it may be gigantic things, but that person will fail you. So that's why we need to have that unconditional or sacrificial love for each other, where we can say, even though you've made a really big mistake here and I'm upset with you, I'm going to give you grace. Now, and again, this is with the caveat that this is in a safe relationship. We don't want to give grace if it's an unsafe relationship. We have to get safety before we can practice these things. And so when you're in that space, we can pull away and we can give love to the other person regardless. So the last point is on truth. So we talked a little bit about some of these things already, but when we think about truth in a safe relationship, what are some of the things that come up when we talk about truth?
Being honest with each other and not being afraid of confrontation. Another way to put that is not being afraid to challenge the other person. We need people to challenge us. Yeah. That helps us grow. It all ties together.
Yeah, in a healthy, challenging way, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so if someone, and again, the things we're talking about is under the context of a safe relationship. So if you're in a safe relationship where someone can confront you, or challenge you, because sometimes when we hear the word confrontation, again, that's one of those words everybody goes, "Ooh, I don't like confrontation." Well, I don't think there are some people, but most of us, when we hear the word confrontation, we're like, "Oh, I can't do that," because it feels wrong. But confrontation, again, can be positive, because if we don't confront, if we don't have that friction between the two people, that's where, not necessarily between the two people, but between the dynamic there, that's where that growth comes from. Because if we don't ever feel friction, we stay stagnant. Yeah.
I also think if someone, if you can't be honest about something someone does that you don't particularly like, for this is an example of that, but I don't particularly like when people hug me. It's a boundary I have. It's just I'm just not.
That's not who you are.
Yeah, it's just not me. But in relationships I have, most of them I've always been able to communicate that I'm not a big fan, and just kind of work that out. That's a silly example, but
it's who you are. It's where you're at with things, and and just letting people know that that's not acceptable for me in this space. And when you're in a safe relationship, they're going to honor that. They're not going to be like, oh, but come on, Taylor, you need my hug. And there are people who will do that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, oh, no, you don't mean that. You need me to hug you. Well, that might be something for us to think about, right? So if somebody does that. So being able to have that space. So acceptance of who they are, being able to be honest with one another, and not avoiding confrontation are all things that kind of tie us back to the idea of trust in a safe relationship. Yeah. So this has been a really good conversation today as we've kind of talked about safe people. Today we've kind of dug into those first ideas of what does it mean to be a safe person? What does it mean to be in a safe relationship? And we've given, hopefully, our audience some things to listen or to think about today as we've really tackled quite a bit of bandwidth. Next time, we're going to really kind of dig into the idea of what is an unsafe person and what does that look like. This topic may have left you wanting to know more about safe people if you're listening in. And if so, we ask that you just share this episode with others and join us next time of part 2 of What is a Safe Person. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've missed any of the previous podcasts, make sure to check them out. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about us, go to our website, peacerestored.net, and don't forget to check out our show notes where you will be able to find links and additional content and some videos as well. We're working on an exciting project, if you've been listening to our podcast, of our classes on demand, which will be released in the next few months. This will be an option for you to be able to do a deeper dive into what we've been talking about to help you learn more about your healing journey, all in the comfort of from your home. So make sure to be watching for that announcement of the release date. As we wrap up our discussion today, make sure to stay tuned as we'll continue to share with you practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.